There is a kind of love that doesn't ask permission to stay. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't fade politely when you tell it to go. It simply exists, quiet and stubborn, in the part of you that never quite finished grieving something you chose to lose. Jaysol Bayek lost her once. He was 24 years old, standing in a boardroom full of people who had decided his future before he ever got to want it, and he let them. He told himself it was duty. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself a lot of things over 20 years, and none of them were true. Now he's 45. His wife is buried. His empire is intact. And somewhere in a small town 300 miles away, Cordelia Shaw is living a life she built entirely without him. A life so quietly whole that when he pulls up to her front door, he will realize he is the one who has been homeless all along. This is the story of what happens when the man who was too afraid to fight finally decides it's not too late. And the woman who loved him has to decide whether to believe him. If you've ever loved someone you had to let go, or been let go by someone who should have held on, this one is for you. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and leave a comment below. Do you believe people deserve a second chance at the love they gave up? Let's talk. The morning Mirai Beck was buried, it rained in Seoul. Not a dramatic rain. No thunder, no wind driving sheets of water sideways. Just a steady, gray, almost courteous rain. The kind that asks nothing of you except to notice it. Jaysol noticed it. He stood at the graveside in a dark suit that had been pressed by someone whose job it was to press his suits, surrounded by people whose grief was genuine and whose presence was required, and he felt something he did not immediately recognize. It took him 3 days to name it. Guilt. Not the guilt of the unfaithful. He had never betrayed Mireille that way. But the older, quieter guilt of the man who gave his wife 20 years of loyalty and not quite enough of himself. The guilt of a man who had always been present in body and somewhere else in the part of him that mattered most. Mireille had known. She was not a foolish woman. She had been kind and capable, and she had made a life beside him with a grace that still moved him when he thought about it. She had given him 2 sons, Juan, now 19, in his first year at university in Boston, and Seo-jin, 16, quiet and watchful and already too much like his father for comfort. She had never once asked him about Cordelia directly, but once, about 12 years into their marriage, she had said something during a quiet dinner that he had never forgotten. "Jaysol," she said, not looking up from her food, "I have always known I was not the first person you loved. I hope you know that being the last one is enough for me." He had reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and he had meant every gesture of that moment, but he had not been able to tell her she was wrong about being second. That was the one thing he could not give her, and they both understood it in the silence that followed, and they had never spoken of it again. They had built something real together in spite of that silence. He wanted to be honest about this, wanted it to be said plainly, without softening. Mireille had not been a placeholder or a footnote. She had been his partner, his son's, mother, a woman of fierce intelligence and dry humor and genuine warmth. She had deserved a husband whose whole heart was available, and she had taken what was available and made something good from it, which was perhaps the most generous thing anyone had ever done for him. She was 44 when the diagnosis came. Pancreatic cancer, found in February 2024, aggressive and swift in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if her body had decided to finish what it needed to do before she changed her mind. She was gone by June. She had been brave about it, in a way that made Jaysol ashamed of every small fear he had ever indulged in his life. He spent the first month after the funeral running the company. He spent the second month running it harder. His assistant, Ji-young, had worked for him for 11 years, and knew him well enough to watch this behavior with the careful, closed face of someone who understands that some griefs need to exhaust themselves before they can be spoken to. It was in the 3rd month, a Tuesday in September, unremarkable in every way, that Jaysol sat down at his desk at 7 in the morning and found he could not open a single file. He sat there for 40 minutes. The city moved 14 floors below his windows. Emails accumulated in neat rows. Ji-young knocked once, read the room through the glass, and retreated without a word. He was thinking about a photograph he no longer had. He had deleted it years ago. A practical decision, the kind you make when you are trying to be a good husband, and you know that certain relics are incompatible with the life you've chosen. It was a photograph taken in the summer of 2001, when he and Cordelia Shaw had been 22 years old and spending a long weekend at a friend's lake house in Georgia. She was laughing at something off camera, turned slightly away from him, and he had taken the picture from behind her left shoulder without her noticing. You couldn't even see her face clearly. He had kept it for 3 years before deleting it. He had never stopped being able to see it when he closed his eyes. He had met Cordelia at a graduate program orientation at Columbia University in September 2001. He had been sent by the Bayek family on a scholarship with clear and explicit instructions. Complete the MBA, build the American network, return. He had arrived with excellent English, excellent manners, an expensive watch, and a perfectly organized internal map of the next 5 years of his life. Cordelia Shaw had upended that map without trying. She was studying urban policy, not business. They shared no classes, no obvious overlap. They met in a coffee line. She was explaining to the person in front of her why the city's zoning decisions were structurally racist, calm, precise, thoroughly uninterested in whether the person wanted to hear it. Ye-sol listened to 6 sentences, introduced himself, and bought her coffee. She looked at him with frank appraisal and said, "That doesn't automatically make you interesting." He had been delighted by that for years. For 2 years they were everything. He didn't know how else to say it. He had dated before, had been liked before, had liked people back. But he had never had the experience of another human being making him feel like the most interesting version of himself. She did that, not by flattering him, but by arguing with him, by asking questions he didn't know the answers to, by laughing when he was being pompous in a way that was so free of cruelty, it somehow made him love her more. She was the first person he had ever known who held him to a higher standard than he held himself and made it feel like a gift rather than a judgment. He had brought her up to his family carefully, strategically. His father had been polite. His mother had been precise, polite in the way that withholds. His grandfather, the true patriarch, the one whose word had the weight of decades of accumulated power, had been quiet for a long time before he said what he said. What he said was not about Cordelia as a person. It was about the company, about public image, about what certain shareholders and business partners would and would not tolerate in the early 2000s, about the Bayek name and what the Bayek name meant, and the responsibilities that came attached to it, and about the arrangement already in motion, Mireille's family, the Lims, a merger dressed as a marriage, understood by everyone as a business transaction with sentimental trappings, except apparently by Ye-sol, who had been the only one not paying attention. He fought. That matters, and he will say so. He did not simply nod and walk away. He argued for 3 weeks. He slept 4 hours a night. He called Cordelia every day during those 3 weeks and told her he was dealing with a difficult family situation and would explain everything soon. She had trusted him because she was the kind of person who trusted the people she loved, and that trust, given so cleanly, made what happened next much heavier to carry. He lost. He lost on a rainy Thursday in March of 2003, in his grandfather's study, in a conversation that ended with the old man looking at him with the saddest eyes Ye-sol had ever seen on him. And that sadness was the thing that told him it was over, more than any argument or ultimatum. His grandfather was not a cruel man. He was a man who had survived things that made him believe that love was not sufficient protection against a difficult world, and he was trying, in the only way he knew, to protect his grandson from something he couldn't see clearly yet. "You are 24 years old," his grandfather said. "You will survive this." He had called Cordelia that same night and told her everything. He had done it on the phone because he was a coward, and he has never forgiven himself for that. He can still hear the quality of the silence that fell after he finished talking. Not stunned silence, not the silence of someone trying to understand, the silence of someone absorbing a thing they had perhaps already known was coming, in some part of themselves they hadn't listened to. She said, "Thank you for telling me." And then she hung up. He called back 6 times. She answered none of them. He showed up at her apartment 2 days later, and her roommate, a tall woman named Patrice, who had always regarded him with a carefully maintained neutrality, told him Cordelia had gone to visit family and hadn't said when she would be back. She didn't come back. He found out 3 weeks later, through a mutual friend, that she had transferred to a program in Chicago. He wrote her a letter, an actual paper letter, 3 pages long, written and rewritten until the words felt honest, and mailed it to her parents, address in Atlanta. He received no reply. After 6 months, he stopped letting himself check. He married Mireille in early 2004. He was 25. He had told himself by then that this was the shape his life was going to take, and that shapes could be inhabited with grace if you approached them correctly. And he had. He had done exactly that, for 20 years. He had been a good husband within the limits of what he had available. He had been an excellent father, fully present in a way he knew mattered. He had built something. It just had a room in it that he had kept cleared for 21 years, in the way you keep a room cleared when you haven't decided what to put in it, and keep telling yourself you'll decide soon. The Tuesday morning in September, when he couldn't open a single file, he sat for 40 minutes and understood that he had run out of reasons to keep that room empty. He picked up his phone. He called Daniel Yun, old Columbia friend, someone who had known both of them during those years, who had stayed in loose, occasional contact with each of them in the way that people do when they share a significant chapter of their lives, and both managed to survive it. They had talked a few times a year for 2 decades, birthdays, condolences, the occasional drink when their cities overlapped. Daniel was one of the few people who had ever been allowed to be in both their worlds. "I need to know where Cordelia is." No preamble, no explanation. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Not a surprised quiet. The quiet of someone who had perhaps been wondering when this call would come. He told Jaisal about a town in North Carolina called Halverton, small, about an hour from Asheville, in the mountain foothills. Cordelia had been there for about 11 years. She ran a community art center she had built from a grant. She was not married. She was, by all accounts, doing genuinely well. "Why are you telling me this?" Jaisal said. It was not quite a question. "Because Mireille died," Daniel said simply. "And I've known you for 23 years, and in 23 years, you have never once asked me where anyone else was." Jaisal sat with that for a moment. Then he ended the call. He called his mother-in-law, Mireille's mother, a formidable woman named Mrs. Lim, who had loved her daughter fiercely and had, in recent months, watched Jaisal with the quiet attention of someone taking inventory. He asked if she could stay with Seojin for a few days. She agreed before he finished explaining. She had always been a perceptive woman. She did not ask where he was going. He did not call ahead. He did not text. He did not give Cordelia the time and space to decide in advance what she would say. He understood this was not entirely fair. He went anyway. He drove out of Charlotte as the afternoon sky was turning gold. The mountains rose on either side of him, and he drove through them with his hands steady on the wheel and his mind very quiet. The way it gets sometimes before a decision that has already been made. He stopped once for gas and coffee and did not taste either. The sky turned purple and then dark. He arrived in Halverton at 10:47 in the evening. The town was small enough that he found the art center in 11 minutes, its name on a modest sign, the building dark. A block behind it, a house with a name on the mailbox that he sat outside and looked at for a long time. A light was on in the front room, warm and still through the curtains. The kind of light that belongs to someone who has built a life around being comfortable alone. He had driven 300 miles. He had not prepared a single word. He got out of the car. She heard the knock at 11 o'clock at night, and her first thought was practical and calm. Someone is lost. It happened sometimes. Mountain roads confused people, and Halverton was a reasonable place to stop and ask directions. She was not afraid. She had lived alone for a long time, and had made peace with the topology of her own solitude. She opened the door with the easy confidence of someone expecting a minor inconvenience. She got J. Sol Bayek. The seconds that followed were not blank. She would think about this later. Turn it over the way you turn something unexpected that you found in a pocket. They were not blank. They were overcrowded. 21 years of a carefully closed door pressurized into a single moment of recognition, and her body responded before her mind had caught up. Her breath changed. Not dramatically, just a subtle recalibration, 3 seconds long. Then she breathed normally again, and she looked at him, and she waited. He looked like himself, and like time together, the way people do when you haven't seen them in 2 decades. The underlying architecture is the same, but the years have settled into it, become structural. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with driving. He looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally run out of arguments for why he should keep carrying it alone. Cordelia. Her name and his voice after 21 years. She had not prepared for that, and she noted her own lack of preparation with something between annoyance and resignation. Yay, Sol. She was proud of how steady her voice was. I drove from Charlotte. I see that. A pause. It's almost 11. I know. I'm sorry about the hour. She considered the door. She considered several things in quick succession, with the speed of someone whose brain is doing triage in real time. Then she stepped back. Not far. Just enough. She stepped back from the door. 5 minutes. You can come in for 5 minutes. He came in and stood in her front room, the warm room where she'd been reading all evening, with her books and plants and the worn throw blanket on the couch. And he looked around at it with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not assessment, not comparison. Something quieter than both. The expression of a person encountering evidence of a life and understanding, on some level, what it means. He was still looking around the room when he spoke. You made something good here. She wanted to put something sharp on that. She let it go. She sat in the armchair and deliberately did not gesture toward the couch. He sat on it anyway. He folded his hands. He looked at the floor briefly. Then he looked at her. Mirai died 4 months ago. I heard. I'm sorry. She meant it, not performatively, but actually. She had never wished harm on Mirai Lim, who had been chosen for circumstances she did not create, and had apparently navigated them with dignity. I need to say some things to you. And then you can do whatever you want with them, and I'll go. And if you don't want me to come back, I won't. Cordelia was 45 years old. She had a master's degree. A community she had built over 11 years. A garden that was difficult in the ways she had chosen, and rewarding in the ways she had earned. She had done 3 years of therapy, good therapy. The kind that asks you to look directly at things rather than around them. She knew herself well. She knew what her damage looked like and where it lived. She also knew, sitting in this room at 11 at night, that she was still in love with this man. Had been continuously, for 23 years, in the way that doesn't announce itself daily, but simply persists in the background. A frequency below the range of sound, present in every room of her life, without filling any of them. That knowledge did not make her generous. It made her careful, which is different. She folded her hands in her lap. Say them, then. He talked for almost an hour. He told her about the boardroom and his grandfather and the 3 weeks of fighting and the night he called her from a hotel room while his hands shook. He told her about the 6 times he called back. He told her about the letter he wrote, 3 pages, mailed to Atlanta, and how he had not received a reply and had eventually accepted that the silence was her answer and had tried to respect it. He told her about Mirai without flinching from the complexity of it. That it had been a real marriage with real moments of genuine connection. That his sons were not accidents or regrets, but the people he loved most on earth. That Mirai had deserved more from him than she got, and had lived with that truth gracefully. He said all of this looking at her, not at the floor. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at her directly. Me, I'm telling you all of this because you deserve the full picture. Not because I think it changes anything, or obligates you to anything, but because you've been living with a version of this story that has pieces missing, pieces I was too ashamed and too afraid to give you at the time. And you deserved them 21 years ago. The room held the quiet that followed. Why didn't you fight harder? It wasn't an accusation. It was the genuine question, the one she had sat with in the dark for 2 decades. And she asked it now while he was here, and she had the chance, because she was 45 and past the age of deferring the questions that actually matter. He was silent for a long time, not avoiding, thinking. I was 24, he finally said, and I believed the people who told me that what I wanted wasn't worth what it would cost. And by the time I understood they were wrong, I had made promises I wasn't willing to break. I told myself for years that was integrity. A pause. I think most of it was fear. I think I called a lot of my fear integrity when I was young. That answer did something to her. Not enough. Nowhere near enough. But something. She recognized the honesty in it. It was not the answer of a man trying to be forgiven. It was the answer of a man who had actually thought about it. She stood and walked to the window. Her garden was dark outside, the shapes of plants just visible, the squash she was good at, the tomatoes she kept trying. Her familiar, her own. There's a motel on Route 9, about 4 miles. Okay. He stood without argument, without pressing. He picked up his keys from the coffee table. He'd set them down when he came in without appearing to notice. Same unconscious habit she remembered from 23 years ago. And walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. Can I come back tomorrow? I'm not trying to push anything. I'd like to walk, or talk, or whatever you'd allow. She thought about saying no. She weighed what it would cost her either way. She thought about the therapy and the years of learning to want things without immediately apologizing for wanting them. There's a trail behind the art center, she said. 7 a.m. She watched his posture change. Not dramatically, but the long, quiet breath he released was its own sentence. She closed the door before she let herself watch more than that. He was there at 10 to 7. She had expected this, and told herself it meant nothing. Then she told herself that was a lie. Then she put on her boots and went outside. The trail climbed through oak and poplar and came out on a ridge that looked at the mountains. A 90-minute walk at a comfortable pace. And Cordelia knew every route and every seasonal change in the light. She walked it now beside Yesol and felt the strange doubling of a place she had always known alone, suddenly containing a person from an entirely different chapter of herself. They talk the way you talk when you're walking, easier than face-to-face, the conversation able to breathe without pressure. He asked about the art center, and she told him about it without false modesty. The small grant 11 years ago. The 3 years of building trust in a community that had every reason to be skeptical of an outsider with good intentions. The moment it had tipped from project to institution. The kids who came after school now because they wanted to, not because a parent sent them. He listened in a way she had forgotten he could, fully in the conversation, not waiting for his turn. She asked about his sons. He talked about them with a warmth that was uncomplicated and immediate. Juan, 19, studying environmental engineering in Boston, stubborn about his academic choices in a way that Jae-Sol admitted made him both frustrated and privately proud. Seo Jin, 16, quieter than his brother, drawn to music, still figuring out the shape of the life he wanted. Jae-Sol described watching them become themselves with the unguarded tenderness of someone who had found this process astonishing and hadn't bothered to pretend otherwise. At the top of the ridge, they stopped and looked at the mountains stretching south toward Tennessee. October light was doing something particular, low and gold, arriving sideways, making the trees extraordinary. He kept his eyes on the mountains for a moment before turning to her. This is why you came here. Partly. She looked at the view. Partly I came because no one here knew anything about me. I could start over completely. And then I stayed because it turned out I liked who I was starting over as. Who is that? She thought about it honestly. Someone who makes things, someone who knows her neighbors and is known by them, someone who grows squash very well and tomatoes badly and has made peace with the asymmetry. A beat. Someone who stopped waiting for her life to begin. She didn't specify what she'd stopped waiting for. He didn't ask. But the space around the unsaid thing was there between them, acknowledged in the way that spaces between people who have history are acknowledged, without words, but unmistakably. Is there someone? He asked, carefully. In your life, I mean. Are you? There have been people. Her voice was level. Nothing that lasted. One of them came close. He was good to me, and I tried, and eventually I understood I was doing us both a disservice. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The reason for the door that wouldn't open was standing at the top of a ridge in North Carolina at 7:30 in the morning, looking at the mountains with an expression that confirmed she hadn't been imagining things for 20 years. They walked back in a comfortable silence that was more troubling to her than any difficult conversation. Comfort with someone you have reasons to be angry at is its own kind of information, and she filed it away. The afternoon after the first walk, she had a meeting she couldn't reschedule, a conversation with the town's parks department about a mural project she'd been trying to get funded for 2 years. She told Jaisal this without apology, and he said, "Go ahead, I'll find something to do." She half expected to come back and find him gone, the way that felt easier to imagine than the alternative. She came back 2 hours later and found him on the porch of the art center talking to Marcus, her part-time facilities manager, a 60-year-old man who had been in Halverton his whole life and had strong opinions about everything, and gave them freely regardless of audience. They were deep in a conversation about local water rights that Jaisal appeared to be genuinely engaged in. Marcus looked up when she arrived and said, "Your friend knows more about water table legislation than I expected." She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or an assessment. With Marcus, it was usually both. She made tea, and they sat on the porch for a while as the light changed, all three of them. And the conversation moved naturally from water rights to the town's history to the question of what makes a community stay together over time versus what makes it fragment. Jaisal listened more than he talked. When he did talk, he was direct without being domineering, and she watched Marcus revise his opinion of the stranger in real time. The slight relaxation in his shoulders that meant he'd decided to stop being watchful. Later, walking home, she thought about what it meant that she was noticing these things, that she was cataloging them, that she had, without making a decision about it, started paying attention to him as someone who was going to be in her life, not just someone she was deciding about. He stayed 3 days. She had not planned for 3 days. She had planned for the walk, possibly coffee, a clear and definitive conversation that established the ground rules of their non-relationship, and him returning to Charlotte having received honesty rather than access. Instead, 3 days. He helped paint a back room at the art center, a volunteer project she'd been deferring for weeks, and he was not good at it, not incompetent, just clearly someone who had not painted a wall in a long time and possibly ever. He was aware of this, did not pretend otherwise, and did it with the mildly determined air of a person who had reached a stage of life where he no longer needed to be good at everything on the first attempt. She found this more disarming than it had any right to be. He met some of her neighbors, the couple next door, her colleague from the art center, the older woman down the street who had opinions about everyone and expressed them directly. He was unpretentious about who he was in a way that surprised her. He didn't volunteer information and didn't perform modesty either. He was just present, in the way she'd always remembered him being present when he chose to be. On the second evening, he cooked dinner using whatever she had in the house. The result was creative in some places and chaotic in others, and genuinely good overall. And they ate it at her kitchen table while it rained outside. And the conversation moved easily through 2 hours without her noticing the time. She noticed the time at midnight, when she stood up to turn off the kitchen light. They had talked about Seoul. She'd never been. and he described it the way people describe places they know from inside. Not the monuments or the tourist logic, but the texture of the neighborhoods, the way certain streets smell at certain hours, the specific quality of the light off the Han River in winter. He talked about it with the affection of someone who had been away long enough to see it clearly. She told him about Atlanta, where she'd grown up, the particular heat, the coded social geography of it, the way her grandmother's neighborhood had changed and kept changing while something essential stayed. They talked about the years between, cautiously at first, then less cautiously. He asked her about Chicago. She told him about the program, the professors she'd argued with and the ones she'd learned from, the year she'd been, in her own accounting, genuinely not okay, and had made it through anyway. He listened to this with the careful attention of someone who understood they were being trusted with something and did not take it lightly. "I thought about contacting you," he said at some point, around 11:30, his coffee cooling in front of him. "More than once. In the early years, I wrote you another letter. She hadn't known this. You didn't send it." "No." He looked at the table. "It wasn't fair. I was married. Whatever I wanted to say, I didn't have the right to say it when I'd chosen something else. So I didn't send it." She sat with that for a moment. It was an honest thing to have done, she thought, even if it had cost her something she would have wanted. Not sending the letter was, in its way, a kind of respect for the life she was trying to build without him. She wasn't sure if she was grateful for it or not. She decided both was probably accurate. She noticed the time at midnight, when she stood up to turn off the kitchen light. He slept at the motel on Route 9 both nights, and was back in the morning without being asked. She noted this. She noted a lot of things during those 3 days, not the things he said, but what the things he said were attached to. Behavior is the only honest language. The therapist had once told her, and she had believed it, and she was reading him now the way she had learned to read. On the third night, after dinner, she told him the thing she had been circling since he arrived. "I need to tell you what it was like for me. My version." She said it looking at him directly. "Because I listened to your version, and I appreciated it, and I think you owed it to me. But you're here, and you've been kind, and I can feel myself softening in ways that concern me. And I need you to understand what you're actually asking me to risk before this goes any further." He set down his cup. He did not try to preempt her. "Tell me." She told him about the year after Columbia, the year she transferred to Chicago and threw herself into her program with the focused desperation of someone using forward motion to outrun grief. The crying in the shower with the water running so her roommate wouldn't hear. Not every day, but for a long time. The gradual, hard, real work of rebuilding herself as someone who didn't organize her entire emotional life around an absence. She told him about the relationships that had gone somewhere real, and the wall each one eventually found, the room in her she didn't know how to unlock, that she had come to understand was not a flaw in her capacity for love, but a door she had left open for someone who hadn't come back through it. She told him about the therapy, about the moment in year 2 when her therapist had said, plainly and without drama, "You are still in love with him." And she had sat with that for a full minute before saying yes. About the work she had done after that, not to stop loving him, which she had eventually understood was not available to her as an option, but to stop making that love the governing fact of her existence, to build a life that was complete, and hers regardless of whether that room ever got its answer. She looked at him. "I do not know how to be someone's consolation prize. I don't know how to be the thing a man reaches for when he's grieving and alone, and the person he was with is gone. And I am not willing. I will not spend the next years of my life finding out I was the latter." The room was very still. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "Those are fair things to say. I don't have an answer to all of them. And I think you'd be right not to believe an immediate answer." "I would. What would you believe?" She thought about it honestly. She was an honest woman. "I'd have to see." He nodded. Slowly. He was not a man who nodded when he didn't mean it, and she noted that too. He drove back to Charlotte. He called the next evening. Not a long call, not pressurized, just the light report of a person saying, "I'm here. I'm thinking of you. This is what today was." He told her Seo Jin had tried a new guitar chord for an hour before getting it. She told him a kid at the art center had refused to paint over a mistake, and they'd had a long conversation about why mistakes are sometimes the most interesting part of the picture. He called the evening after that. And the evening after that. She found herself reorganizing small things so she'd be home by 7. A walk rerouted. A late meeting moved up. She noticed herself doing this and didn't comment on it to herself, which was its own kind of commentary. What struck her, in those 3 weeks of calls, was the absence of strategy in them. She had known enough men, dated enough people who were working towards something, to recognize when a conversation was a tool. These weren't. He talked about Seo Jin's school conference with the slight helplessness of a parent who understands that their teenager is smarter than the situation they're in and cannot say so out loud. He mentioned, once, that he'd been going through some of Mireille's things and had found a box of letters she'd written to her own mother. Letters she'd never sent, apparently, just written for the processing of it. And he'd sat with those for a long time and then put them back in the box. He said this the way you say things that haven't finished becoming stories yet. Things you're still inside. She didn't try to turn it into anything. She just said, "That sounds like a lot." And he said, "Yes." And they moved on. She told him one evening about the 12-year-old and the abstract painting. About how the girl had come in after school in tears because another student had laughed at her work, and Cordelia had sat with her for an hour, not minimizing the hurt, but redirecting the question from, "Is my art good?" to, "What does your art do for you?" About how the girl had left still sad but thinking about a different thing. He was quiet for a moment after she told it, and then he said, "You're very good at that." Just that, without elaboration, in a way that landed differently than a compliment. Like a fact being stated, rather than an offering being made. She had not been loved cleanly in a long time. She was aware of that. 3 weeks in, he mentioned that Juan had come home from Boston for a long weekend. He had told Juan about her. Just that she was someone from his past he had reconnected with. Someone who mattered. Juan had looked at his father for a long, quiet moment and said, "Good." One word. It had made Jaisal laugh. A real laugh. Surprised out of him. The kind she had always liked. She smiled in her kitchen listening to it. She made no comment. It was the 4th week that tested things. She had known, abstractly, that Jaisal was a public figure. She had followed the business news enough over the years to understand the scale of what he'd built, had occasionally seen his name in financial coverage or Korean corporate reporting. She had filed that knowledge in the category of not her world and left it there, because her world was Halverton and the art center and the mountain trails, and those things were hers. The story appeared on a Friday afternoon. A Seoul-based entertainment news outlet, the kind that moved at the intersection of celebrity and business gossip, posted a speculative piece based on what was clearly an inside source. It was vague enough to be unprovable and specific enough to be aimed. Grieving Bayek Industries chairman, making repeated trips to the American South. Friends say he may be reconnecting with a figure from his past. It did not name her, but it named Halverton. It named the art center. By Saturday morning, there were 3 cars parked on her street that did not belong to anyone she knew. She called him. She did not raise her voice. That was not how she expressed serious things. But her voice was flat and precise, the voice she used when something mattered enough to strip all decoration from it. "I built a life here. These people know me. I have a reputation in this community that I spent 11 years earning. I'm not willing to become a story for someone else's entertainment. This is not something I will negotiate on." He was quiet for a moment. Not a defensive quiet. "I know. I should have thought about this more carefully before I came. That's on me." "Yes," she said. It is. I'm going to handle it today. Not a corporate statement. Something that actually addresses it. Give me 24 hours. A statement. Her voice did not change. Cordelia, I know what you're thinking. A pause. Do you? You're thinking, here is the moment where things get complicated and he manages them instead of fighting for what matters. He said it evenly, without defensiveness. I understand why you'd think that. Give me 24 hours to prove you wrong. She was quiet for a moment. Then, 24 hours. She found out afterward, not from him, but from Daniel, who had heard from someone who knew the journalist, that J-Sol had called the reporter directly. He had not threatened. He had not deployed lawyers or issued corporate communications. He had been personally, clearly, and absolutely direct. Pursuing this would damage a relationship he was not willing to have damaged, and he considered the matter closed. Then he posted something on his personal social account, a platform he rarely used, which made the post visible by its unusualness, that said simply, "My private life and the private lives of people I care about are not available for public consumption. I will not be commenting on personal matters. I expect this to be respected." Brief, unambiguous, containing, underneath its measured language, something that was not management or strategy, something that was actual anger, the kind you only have when something genuinely matters to you. The cars left her street by Sunday morning. She sat with what he had done. She turned it over and held it next to the thing she was afraid of. That when things became difficult, when the real world arrived with its complications, he would revert to managing and accommodating and smoothing things over, rather than standing and defending. That was the pattern she knew. That was what he had done at 24. He had not done that. He had stood and defended. Not in a performative way, not loudly, not in a way that made him the hero of the story. He had simply handled it, with the directness of someone who had decided that certain things were not available for compromise. She called him Sunday evening. "The cars are gone." "I know. I made sure." A pause. Not empty. Full, actually. Full of the weight of what was shifting between them. "J-Sol." She stopped. Tried again. "Thank you." A different kind of silence then. Softer than the ones before. She stood in her kitchen where she had cooked dinner alone for 11 years and looked at the window and understood that she was frightened in the specific way that means you are about to do something that matters. "I need to see you." The words were out before she'd finished deciding to say them. And then, because 21 years of careful management of her own wanting had to end somewhere, and she had promised herself honesty, "I need you to come back." He drove back the following Friday afternoon. October light, low and gold, the mountains beginning their annual transformation, the oaks and maples pulling color up from somewhere internal, becoming briefly extraordinary before letting everything go. He had made this drive twice now. He was starting to know which stretches of road had the best views, which exits had coffee worth stopping for. He had made one call before leaving Charlotte that Friday, not to Daniel, not to Ji Young. He had called Seo Jin. His younger son had answered on the second ring. J-Sol had kept it simple. He was driving back to North Carolina to see someone who mattered to him, and he wanted Seo Jin to know. There had been a silence on the line, the particular silence of a 16-year-old processing something larger than he'd prepared for. Then Seo Jin said, "Okay, Dad," in a voice that was working to stay neutral and not quite managing it. A beat. Then, "I hope it goes well." J-Sol had held the phone a moment after they hung up, thinking about his younger son, quiet, watchful, already too much like him. Maybe about to learn, from a little distance, something his father had taken 45 years to understand about not letting fear make the decisions that matter. He pulled up to the art center first, because she had told him she'd be there until 4. He went inside and found her in the newly painted back room, now hung with the kids, work for the upcoming show, leading a small group of parents through it. She was describing a piece, the abstract one, the 12-year-olds, with genuine pride, the way you talk about something you've watched become good from the beginning. She saw him come in. She finished the sentence she was saying, let the parents move on to the next piece, and walked across the room to him. She was wearing paint on her left forearm. She hadn't noticed. He noticed and said nothing. She glanced at the walls around them. The kids work in its new frames. The show opens Thursday. If you want to be here for it, I'll be here. They stood in the room full of children's art, afternoon light doing something lovely with the windows, and neither of them moved for a moment. The room held them. She looked at him in the afternoon light, no careful management in her face. I'm scared. I want you to know that. I'm genuinely scared. So am I. She looked at him. You're scared. Cordelia, I've been scared since I pulled out of Charlotte. The difference between now and 21 years ago is that I understand which thing I'm more afraid of. He held her gaze without pretense. I am more afraid of going home and spending the rest of my life with a room I never opened. I am more afraid of that than I am of anything that comes with trying. She had done the therapy. She knew what healthy looked like, and what it sounded like, and, most importantly, what it looked like when words and behavior were attached to each other versus when they were separate. She had been watching him for weeks, reading the language underneath the language. The consistency of the calls, the patience that did not feel performed, the way he had handled the press intrusion, not by managing her but by protecting her, and by being genuinely angry about it rather than strategically controlled. The way he spoke about his sons and his grief and his failures with an honesty that had no audience to perform for. She reached out and touched his hand. Brief, just her fingers on the back of his hand for a moment. He went very still, pinning the trail tomorrow. A pause. 7 a.m. I'll be there. She went back to the parents and the art show and the 12-year-old's abstract piece that deserved a longer look than most people were giving it. Yesol stood in the room for another minute before he went to find the motel on Route 9. Something in the way he stood was different from every other time he had occupied a space in his life. Less composed, more present. Like a man who has put down something he's been carrying for a very long time and is still slightly surprised by the lightness. He was at the trailhead at 10 to 7. She had expected this. She no longer bothered telling herself it didn't mean anything. They walked up through the October morning, the air sharp and clean, the leaves doing what they do when they've decided to be extraordinary in their last days. The light came sideways through the trees, catching everything, the curve of a root, the surface of a stone, the place where the trail bent toward the view. At the top of the ridge they stopped. The mountains stretched south and west, deeply colored, patient in the way that old things are patient. She looked out at the mountains, not at him. I don't know what this looks like. Practically, you're in Charlotte. Your sons are there. My life is here. I know. I'm not moving. I'm not asking you to. She looked at him. What are you asking? He turned toward her fully. He had spent the drive and the evening and the hours before sleep thinking about this, not preparing something to say, but getting honest about what was actually true, stripped of everything he knew how to use as cover. I'm asking to show up, imperfectly and repeatedly. I'm asking to be in your life in whatever way fits your life, not alongside it, in it. I'm not asking you to trust me completely yet. I understand why you can't. I'm asking you to let me earn it. Week by week, badly painted walls and 7 a.m., trails and whatever else you're willing to let me in on. That's a lot of driving. 300 miles is nothing. His voice was steady and quiet. Cordelia, I have been 300 miles from you for 21 years, and most of that time I didn't even have the courage to acknowledge it. 300 miles with a destination is a completely different thing. She stood at the top of the ridge in the October light and let herself feel the thing she had been managing for so long. Not carefully. Just feel it. the room she had kept cleared. The weight of the door she'd left unlocked all this time, telling herself she'd just forgotten to lock it, that it meant nothing. She thought about the 12-year-old in the art center below, who kept apologizing for her paintings before anyone had looked at them, who had learned somewhere in her short life that wanting things made you vulnerable and had decided in response to preemptively diminish what she made. Cordelia had spent months trying to teach her that the apology wasn't protection. It was just a smaller version of the abandonment she was afraid of. You don't have to apologize for what you make. You just have to make it and stand beside it. She turned and looked at Jaisal Bak, the man she had loved at 22 and never properly stopped loving, who had failed her in a way that was real and permanent, and had spent 21 years living inside that failure's consequences, who had driven 300 miles twice and shown up, in the actual difficult moment, when the press arrived and things became complicated, as someone different from the 24-year-old who had chosen duty over love. People could change. She believed this, and held its opposite in the other hand. That not everyone did. That change required something most people didn't have access to. But she had changed. She knew she had, because she could remember who she was before the therapy, and before Halverton, and before the slow, patient work of becoming herself. And that person and this person were related, but not the same. She had become more fully herself. It seemed possible, not certain, but genuinely possible, that he had too. She turned and looked at the mountains one last time. Then she looked at him. Okay. His breath changed, the same way hers had on the doorstep, weeks ago. Involuntary. A whole world in a single adjustment. Okay? You can show up. She met his eyes directly, fully, without the careful managing. But hear me. If you stop showing up, that's it. I'm not waiting again. I spent enough time waiting, and I'm not going to do that to myself again. This is the last time I open this door. I understand, he said. And the way he said it, not reassuring, not rushing to make her feel better, but matching the weight of what she was telling him with equal seriousness, let her believe him. Not completely. Not yet, but enough to step forward. She did not take his hand on the way down, but she walked close enough on the narrow parts of the trail that their arms touched occasionally, and neither of them mentioned it, and both of them noticed, and that was enough. They came out of the trees into the morning. The town was there, her town, her art center, her life, whole and hers. He was in it now, not replacing anything, not filling anything except the room she had kept cleared for 21 years, which turned out to have been waiting not to be filled, but to be chosen. She unlocked the art center and held the door open. He walked through it. The show opened Thursday. She had been preparing for weeks. The hanging, the lighting adjustments, the small plaques with the kids, names and the titles they'd given their work, which were sometimes funny and sometimes devastating and occasionally both. She had done this 11 times now, the annual show, and it still made her feel something specific the night before. A quietness inside the work, a satisfaction that wasn't separate from the work, but part of it. Jaisal came to the opening. He stood in the back for most of it, watching. Watching her work the room more than watching the art, she suspected. Watching how she moved through the space, how she knew every kid's name and every parent's name and what each painting had been before it became what it was. She caught his eye once across the room. He didn't smile. He just held her gaze for a moment. And what was in it was something she filed carefully, for later. Afterward, when everyone had gone and she was putting out the lights, he helped carry the folding table back to the storage room. It took 4 minutes. It was completely ordinary. She thought about that on the walk home, how the ordinary parts had always been the ones she trusted. You could perform the dramatic moments. You couldn't perform 4 minutes with a folding table, 300 miles, twice, and the distance between them narrowing by the week. Some loves don't ask permission to stay. They just wait, patient and inconvenient, for you to stop pretending the room is empty. And that's where we leave them. On the threshold of something honest, something chosen this time, Something both of them are walking into with their eyes open and their histories intact. No shortcuts. No fairy tale. Just two people who did enough work on themselves to be ready for what they almost had 21 years ago. If this story moved you, give it a like. It means more than you know. And tell me in the comments, do you believe first love ever really leaves? Or does it just find a quieter place to wait? See you in the next one.